The plane was ready for takeoff. The atmosphere was busy, filled with passengers finding their seats, stowing their luggage, and preparing for their journey to New York. The hum of excited chatter filled the cabin as passengers made their way down the aisles. Among them was Mrs. Dorothy Green, a black woman in her early 70s, carrying the kind of grace that had been honed over decades of experience in life. Despite her age, Mrs. Green still had a sparkle in her eyes, a curiosity for the world, a thirst for new experiences. She had already traveled the world, visiting family, friends, and even taking solo vacations to some of the most beautiful places. But today, there was something different about the trip. Perhaps it was her age, or perhaps it was the way people looked at her. She often felt invisible. But this time, as she entered the plane and made her way down the narrow aisle, she felt eyes on her. Most passengers were too caught up in their own world to notice her, but a few exchanged curious glances. She settled into her seat by the window. She wasn't in a rush, nor was she worried. She took her time, quietly adjusting her purse, looking for a comfortable position. The flight attendants, bustling around in the cramped aisles, hardly gave her a second glance. Samantha, one of the flight attendants, was no stranger to her job. She had been working on planes for 5 years, and over time she'd become quite confident, perhaps even too confident. She had learned to handle almost every kind of passenger with ease, demanding customers, unruly children, and even the occasional nervous flyer. But today, as she moved down the aisle, she spotted Mrs. Green struggling with her carry-on luggage. With an eye roll, she walked past. She didn't have time for distractions. It was just another elderly passenger who couldn't manage their belongings. She had bigger things to worry about. The passengers needed to be seated quickly. They had a flight to catch. But something about Mrs. Green seemed different. Her frail movements, her quiet demeanor. But that didn't slow Samantha down. It wasn't long before Mrs. Green looked up, noticing the hurried flight attendant's movement. "Excuse me, dear," she said softly, her voice calm but edged with the hesitation of someone not wanting to be a burden. "Could you help me with my purse, please? It's caught in the overhead bin." Samantha, who had barely stopped to think, didn't even glance up. "We're about to take off, ma'am. You'll need to move faster," she said with an air of impatience. "I'm sorry, dear. It's just a little difficult for me." Mrs. Green's words were almost drowned out by the noise of other passengers settling in, but the kindness in her voice was unmistakable. Samantha paused, the irritation she had been suppressing bubbling over. "You should have had this sorted before we boarded. I don't have time to cater to every inconvenience." There was an edge to her voice, a sharpness that cut through the air like a blade. Mrs. Green's face flushed slightly. She wasn't used to being spoken to in such a way. But instead of defending herself, she just nodded and quietly tried to manage the situation on her own. She struggled for a moment, but then managed to free her purse from the overhead compartment. Samantha handed it to her quickly, clearly annoyed. "Here," she said, her tone stiff. "Make sure your seatbelt is fastened. We don't have time for delays." Mrs. Green felt a sting, but she said nothing. She simply adjusted her seatbelt and nodded politely, a soft sigh escaping her lips. It wasn't the first time someone had treated her like this, but it still hurt. Samantha didn't even look back as she moved on to the next row of passengers. She had a job to do. The passengers needed to be comfortable and prepared for the flight, and she didn't have the patience for what she perceived as small, unnecessary requests. As the final passengers boarded, the tension in the cabin rose. People were anxious, eager to get the flight underway. Samantha's job had become more stressful as the minutes ticked by. There was a flurry of movement as everyone settled into their seats, buckling seat belts and stowing bags. But as she passed by Mrs. Green's seat once again, she noticed the elderly woman was still struggling with something. "Is there a problem, Ma'am?" Samantha asked, her voice strained but with an undercurrent of frustration. "We need to finish the safety procedures before we can depart." Mrs. Green looked up, slightly flustered. "I'm just a little uncomfortable, dear. Would it be all right if I just adjusted my seat a bit?" The simple request felt like a further delay in Samantha's mind. Her patience was fraying, and she didn't care who saw it. She had other passengers to attend to, and the flight was running behind. Her professional veneer started to crack, revealing an impatience she couldn't quite hide. "We can't keep holding things up for you," Samantha said, her voice sharp, louder than necessary. "Either you settle in, or I'll have to remove you from the plane." The words were cold and cutting. The entire cabin seemed to freeze as the words left Samantha's mouth. Mrs. Green's face went pale. She blinked rapidly, as if she couldn't process what had just happened. No one, least of all someone like her, had ever been spoken to in such a way. What did you say?" Mrs. Green whispered, her voice barely audible. Samantha crossed her arms. "I said you have to sit properly, or you'll need to leave the plane. It's a safety issue." The words hung in the air. Mrs. Green's heart dropped into her stomach, but she was too stunned to argue. She stood up slowly, clutching her purse tightly, her hands shaking slightly. As Mrs. Green began walking toward the front of the plane to leave, the other passengers started to murmur in disbelief. They couldn't believe what was happening. They watched as the elderly woman, clearly shaken, made her way toward the exit. But it wasn't until the gate agent appeared in response to the situation that things started to unravel. The agent, who had overheard the interaction, immediately approached Samantha. "Is there a problem?" the agent asked, his tone calm but authoritative. Samantha quickly explained the situation, telling him that Mrs. Green had been struggling with her seat and wasn't following instructions. But the gate agent paused, listening more carefully now, his brow furrowed in confusion. "We have a policy for this," the agent said slowly. "But we don't just throw people off a plane like this. Let me check with the captain." He turned to Mrs. Green. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am. I'll get this sorted out right away. Please return to your seat." Mrs. Green, still numb with shock, quietly made her way back to her seat. The passengers, watching the scene unfold, exchanged uneasy glances. They could tell something was wrong, and now it was becoming clear that it wasn't Mrs. Green who had done anything wrong. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Samantha watched silently, realizing she had crossed a line, but she couldn't bring herself to apologize. Not yet. The captain's voice soon came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We're just going to make sure everything is properly sorted before we take off. We ask for your patience as we work through this." As Mrs. Green began walking toward the front of the plane to leave, the other passengers started to murmur in disbelief. They couldn't believe what was happening. They watched as the elderly woman, clearly shaken, made her way toward the exit. But it wasn't until the gate agent appeared in response to the situation that things started to unravel. The agent, who had overheard the interaction, immediately approached Samantha. "Is there a problem?" the agent asked, his tone calm but authoritative. Samantha quickly explained the situation, telling him that Mrs. Green had been struggling with her seat and wasn't following instructions. But the gate agent paused, listening more carefully now, his brow furrowed in confusion. "We have a policy for this," the agent said slowly, "but we don't just throw people off a plane like this. Let me check with the captain." He turned to Mrs. Green. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am. I'll get this sorted out right away. Please return to your seat." Mrs. Green, still numb with shock, quietly made her way back to her seat. The passengers, watching the scene unfold, exchanged uneasy glances. They could tell something was wrong, and now it was becoming clear that it wasn't Mrs. Green who had done anything wrong. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Samantha watched silently, realizing she had crossed a line, but she couldn't bring herself to apologize. Not yet. The captain's voice soon came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We're just going to make sure everything is properly sorted before we take off. We ask for your patience as we work through this." The flight continued, but Samantha couldn't shake the heavy feeling in her chest. The earlier actions weighed on her conscience, and she knew she had to make it right. Finally, during the beverage service, she found the courage to approach Mrs. Green once more. "I owe you an apology," Samantha said, her voice shaky. "What I said was unforgivable. I was wrong to treat you that way. Please forgive me." Mrs. Green looked up, her eyes soft and understanding. "It's okay, dear," she said with a gentle smile. "We all make mistakes. I've learned a lot from my life, and I know that sometimes people just need a reminder." Samantha nodded, feeling the full weight of her actions. She knew this was a moment that would stay with her forever, a lesson that would shape how she approached people, how she saw the world from now on. And as the plane finally began its descent, Samantha promised herself that she would never forget the lesson of kindness and understanding. Mrs. Green had shown her a side of life that had been hidden from her, the true essence of grace and dignity, no matter the circumstances. As the flight continued, Samantha couldn't shake the images of Mrs. Green's gentle face from her mind. She had lived with the thought that people like Mrs. Green were frail, dependent on others, and somewhat invisible to the world. But now she realized how wrong she had been. She had seen Mrs. Green only through the lens of her age and physical appearance. She had assumed that the elderly woman could barely manage, that she would be a burden on the flight. What Samantha had failed to see until now was that Mrs. Green was a person with stories, with experiences, and with dignity that surpassed her outward appearance. Samantha couldn't help but feel embarrassed. The moment of impatience she had shown, the way she had dismissed Mrs. Green as a nuisance, seemed so trivial and petty now. Samantha's mind replayed her words. "I don't have time to cater to every inconvenience." The arrogance in her tone struck her with an almost physical force. She glanced over at Mrs. Green, who was seated peacefully by the window, looking out at the clouds as though she had no care in the world. She had not asked for any special treatment or recognition. She had simply wanted to get to her seat with a little help, but instead she had been met with hostility and judgment. Samantha's stomach churned as she thought about the way she had treated the woman. For the rest of the flight, Samantha couldn't help but observe Mrs. Green, who sat gracefully, calm and composed, surrounded by the noise of the plane. She was unlike anyone Samantha had met before. The way Mrs. Green held herself spoke of a wisdom that Samantha could not ignore. She had lived a life filled with struggles, triumphs, losses, and joys, and she still carried herself with dignity and grace. At that moment, Samantha realized that age and appearance were nothing more than a facade. What mattered was the person beneath it, the heart, the spirit, and the life lived. As the plane neared its destination, Samantha found herself standing near Mrs. Green once again. It was the last stretch of the flight, and most passengers were packing up their belongings, preparing to disembark. She approached Mrs. Green slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. There was a vulnerability in her actions, a desire to make things right. The anger and irritation she had felt earlier were now replaced by a deep sense of remorse. "Mrs. Green," Samantha began, her voice soft but sincere, "I just want to thank you. I don't think I can fully explain how sorry I am for the way I treated you earlier." Mrs. Green turned to look at her, her eyes warm and wise. "There's no need to apologize, dear. You've already shown that you're trying to be better. That's all any of us can do." Samantha felt a wave of emotion rise within her, a mixture of relief and gratitude. Here was a woman who had every right to be angry, to hold a grudge, but instead she offered forgiveness and understanding. "I was wrong to judge you," Samantha continued. I let my assumptions about you cloud my judgment. I should have been more kind, more patient." Mrs. Green smiled gently, her wrinkles softening as she did. "We all make mistakes, dear. It's part of life. What matters is what we learn from them. You've already learned a great lesson today, and for that, I'm proud of you." Samantha's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to appear weak. But deep down she knew that Mrs. Green's words were the truth. Samantha had learned something profound, something that would change her forever. She had learned the value of seeing people for who they truly were, not just who they appeared to be. The flight attendants and passengers around them, who had been quietly observing the interaction, seemed to sense the shift in the air. Samantha's apology and Mrs. Green's graciousness had transformed the mood in the cabin. The uncomfortable tension had melted away, replaced by an unspoken understanding. People, whether old or young, rich or poor, black or white, were all deserving of respect. As the plane landed and passengers began to file out, Mrs. Green stopped Samantha one last time. "I'll be in New York for a little while," she said, smiling. "If you ever find yourself here and in need of someone to talk to, please don't hesitate to reach out. Sometimes we need to talk to people who can remind us of what really matters." Samantha blinked in surprise. "You mean it?" Mrs. Green nodded. "Of course, it's never too late to make new connections." Samantha felt a sense of warmth in her chest. It was an invitation, a gesture that meant more than Mrs. Green could have realized. The idea of connecting with someone so full of life, despite the harsh treatment she had endured earlier, was a gift. It was a new beginning. Weeks passed, and Samantha found herself thinking about Mrs. Green often. She kept the elderly woman's phone number on her phone, a small reminder that there was always room for growth, no matter how old or young you were. She found herself looking at her passengers differently now. When she assisted elderly travelers, she did so with a greater sense of care and respect. She had stopped rushing through her job, taking the time to make each person feel valued. The anger that had once bubbled beneath the surface was replaced with a calm patience that felt natural. She had become someone new. Samantha even found herself sharing the story of Mrs. Green with other flight attendants. She told them about the lesson she had learned from the elderly woman, how sometimes the most important lessons in life come from the most unexpected places. But one thing Samantha had learned more than anything else was that we should never judge anyone based on their appearance, age, race, or station in life. People carried within them stories, experiences, and wisdom that could change the course of someone else's life if they just took the time to listen. Samantha's job didn't change. She still worked as a flight attendant, helping passengers and ensuring their safety. But her heart had transformed in a way that she hadn't expected. She had learned to look deeper, to appreciate the value in everyone, regardless of their appearance. Years later, she still remembered the day she met Mrs. Green. It wasn't just the kindness that Mrs. Green showed that had impacted her. It was the quiet strength in the older woman's ability to forgive, to see humanity in a situation that had been fraught with conflict. It was a strength that Samantha carried with her every day. And while she never saw Mrs. Green again, the lessons she learned from that brief encounter stayed with her, guiding her through every decision, every conversation, and every challenge that came her way. Samantha continued her life, always with an awareness of how fragile judgment could be and how important it was to treat everyone with kindness and respect. Her brief encounter with Mrs. Green had changed everything. It had shown her the depth of human connection and the profound impact of empathy. The words Mrs. Green had shared, "We all make mistakes, dear. What matters is what we learn from them," remained with Samantha. They reminded her that it wasn't too late to be better, to be kinder, to be more understanding. And as Samantha continued to fly, she carried with her not just the memory of Mrs. Green, but the profound wisdom that had been shared in a single moment, one that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Months passed, and Samantha continued to think about Mrs. Green's grace and forgiveness. Her actions that day had changed her fundamentally, and she could feel the ripple effects in her day-to-day life. At work, her relationships with her colleagues had improved. Where she once might have been impatient or dismissive, she was now the first to lend a hand when someone needed help. If an elderly passenger struggled with their bags or seemed nervous about flying, Samantha took the time to assist, no matter how much of a rush she was in. Her interactions were no longer about getting things done quickly, but about making the person in front of her feel seen, heard, and valued. One day as she was walking through the airport during a layover, Samantha noticed an older man sitting alone on a bench. His clothes were worn, and his eyes looked tired. He seemed lost in thought, unsure of where to go or what to do next. Instantly, Samantha thought of Mrs. Green and how she had made her feel when she had been treated poorly. It was as if Mrs. Green's wisdom had become a guiding light in her own life. Samantha approached the man, offering him a warm smile. "Excuse me, sir," she began. "I couldn't help but notice that you seem a bit lost. Can I help you with anything?" The man looked up, his expression softening at her kindness. "I'm just waiting for my flight. I'm not sure what gate I'm supposed to be at. It's been a long day." Samantha nodded, recognizing the exhaustion in his voice. "Let me take a look at your boarding pass," she offered, pulling out her phone to check the gate information. Within minutes, she had him on the right path, and he thanked her repeatedly for her help. As he walked toward his gate, Samantha felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just that she had helped him find his way. It was that, in doing so, she had passed on the lesson she had learned from Mrs. Green. It was a lesson about seeing the humanity in others and taking the time to make their day a little brighter. Not every day was easy, of course. Samantha still faced moments where her patience was tested, where she was tempted to slip back into her old judgmental ways. One afternoon, she was dealing with a particularly difficult passenger. A man had been rude and demanding, constantly complaining about the smallest things. His seat wasn't reclining properly, the food wasn't warm enough, the air conditioning was too cold. It felt as though no matter what she did, it wasn't good enough. Samantha tried to remain calm, repeating her mantra, "See the person beneath the behavior." But the man's sharp words cut through her, and frustration bubbled up inside her. For a moment she considered snapping back, telling him to calm down and be grateful for the service he was receiving. But then she remembered Mrs. Green, her patience, her understanding, her refusal to react with anger. Samantha took a deep breath, reminding herself that everyone was dealing with something in their own lives, something that she couldn't see. Maybe this man was going through a tough time, just as Mrs. Green had lived through hardships that no one could have guessed. "Sir," Samantha said, her voice steady, "I understand that you're frustrated, and I want to make sure you're comfortable. I'm doing everything I can to help you, and I'm here if you need anything else." For a moment there was silence between them. Then the man sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "I've just had a rough few days." Samantha nodded, offering a small, understanding smile. "I understand. We all have those days. Let me know if you need anything, okay?" As she walked away, Samantha felt the weight of the encounter lift from her. She hadn't reacted in anger. She had reacted with compassion, with the same grace that Mrs. Green had shown her. And in doing so, she had not only diffused the situation, but she had made the man's day a little better. It was moments like this, small but meaningful, that reminded Samantha of her growth. Every day was an opportunity to practice kindness, to be the person who saw the good in others, even when it was hidden behind layers of frustration or impatience. As Samantha sat in her hotel room later that night, reflecting on the events of the day, she found herself reaching for her phone. She hadn't spoken to Mrs. Green in a while, but she had saved the elderly woman's number. After everything she had learned, Samantha realized she hadn't fully thanked Mrs. Green for all the lessons she had taught her. It was time to reconnect. She typed out a simple message. "Mrs. Green, I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I just wanted to thank you again for the kindness you showed me that day on the plane. I've been doing my best to live by the lessons you taught me, and I'm so grateful for you. I hope you're doing well." She paused, her finger hovering over the send button, unsure of whether it was enough to express the depth of her gratitude. But before she could second-guess herself, she hit send. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed with a response. "Samantha, it's so good to hear from you. You're very welcome. I always knew you had the potential for great kindness. Keep up the good work, and remember, we are all connected in this world. Kindness is the thread that binds us all together. I'm proud of you." Samantha smiled as she read the message. It was simple, yet powerful, exactly like Mrs. Green. The elderly woman had a way of making her feel like she was capable of more than she ever thought possible. Her words had never been about lecturing or pushing. They had always been about lifting others up, encouraging them to be better without even realizing they were being taught. Inspired by the wisdom of Mrs. Green and the lessons she had learned over the months, Samantha began to take her new outlook on life beyond her job as a flight attendant. She realized that the changes she had made in her day-to-day interactions were small, but they had the potential to create a larger impact. She started volunteering with organizations that helped the elderly, providing companionship to people who were often isolated and forgotten. She spoke at schools about the importance of kindness, sharing her story about Mrs. Green and how one encounter had altered her life. Samantha's story became one of transformation, not just for her but for those around her. She became known not just as a flight attendant, but as a person who brought light into the lives of others. People who had once been cynical and impatient now turned to her for advice, drawn to the quiet strength she carried. Through her own actions, Samantha became a living example of what it meant to live with empathy and understanding. And every time she helped someone, every time she shared a moment of kindness, she thought of Mrs. Green, the woman who had started it all, whose simple grace had changed the course of her life forever. Samantha never saw Mrs. Green again, but the elderly woman's influence remained with her every day. It wasn't just the forgiveness that Mrs. Green had shown, nor the wisdom she had shared. but the quiet strength of her character that had left an indelible mark on Samantha. In a world full of distractions and judgments, it was easy to overlook the beauty in others, to forget that every person carried a lifetime of experiences, stories, and wisdom. But Mrs. Green had taught Samantha to always look deeper, to always choose kindness, no matter the circumstances. And as Samantha continued to navigate her life, she knew that the most important thing she could do was to remember Mrs. Green's words. Kindness is the thread that binds us all together. She would carry that lesson with her for the rest of her days, passing it on to anyone who needed to hear it, just as Mrs. Green had done for her. Years passed, but the lessons that Mrs. Green had taught Samantha never left her. Every now and then, Samantha would find herself reflecting on that fateful flight, the one that changed her perspective on the world forever. She often thought of how she had treated Mrs. Green that day, impatient, dismissive, and unaware of the depth of the woman's life experience. But she also thought of how Mrs. Green's simple, unwavering kindness had softened her heart and opened her eyes to a different way of seeing the world. Samantha had gone on to become a mentor to younger flight attendants, teaching them not just about customer service, but about empathy, compassion, and the power of seeing the humanity in every passenger they encountered. She would tell them her story about Mrs. Green and how that moment had reshaped her life. She emphasized the importance of slowing down, of truly connecting with others, especially when it felt easiest to rush past them. But it wasn't just her work life that had been affected. Samantha's personal relationships had flourished as well. She found herself becoming more patient with her friends and family, less quick to judge and more willing to listen. Even when things were tough, she had learned to approach every challenge with a sense of understanding and calm that she hadn't possessed before. As the years went by, Samantha became known as someone who radiated positivity, someone who could be counted on to lift up the people around her. But she always credited Mrs. Green as the source of her transformation. One day, while on a layover in New York, Samantha took a walk through Central Park to clear her head. It was a beautiful, crisp day, and the park was full of people enjoying the outdoors. As she strolled along the path, she spotted an elderly woman sitting alone on a bench. She was reading a book, her glasses perched on the end of her nose, a serene expression on her face. The woman reminded Samantha of Mrs. Green, so graceful, so full of quiet wisdom. Instantly, Samantha felt compelled to approach her. She sat down on the bench beside her, offering a gentle smile. "Hello," Samantha greeted her warmly. "I hope you don't mind me sitting here. It's such a beautiful day, and I couldn't help but notice how peaceful you look." The woman looked up from her book and smiled back. "Of course, dear. Please sit. The world is much more beautiful when shared." Samantha smiled, feeling an instant connection to the woman even though they had just met. "I agree. I've always believed that kindness makes the world a better place." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, and you remind me of someone I knew once. She had a similar spirit, one that saw the good in everyone." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. Could this be a coincidence? She was about to ask the woman if she knew Mrs. Green when the elderly woman looked at her with knowing eyes. "Are you Samantha?" she asked, her voice gentle but knowing. Samantha's eyes widened in surprise. "Yes. How did you know my name?" The woman smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I know you, dear. I've heard all about you from Mrs. Green. She always spoke so highly of you. She was so proud of how far you'd come." Tears welled up in Samantha's eyes as the memory of Mrs. Green flooded back to her. "You know Mrs. Green?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I do," the woman replied softly. "I'm her sister. She spoke of you often, and I've been following your journey from afar. You've done well, Samantha. She would be proud of the person you've become." Samantha sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed with emotion. She had always wondered what had happened to Mrs. Green after that flight. To hear that she had been a part of Mrs. Green's life, even from afar, was a gift she never expected. The woman placed her hand gently on Samantha's. "Your kindness has reached far beyond what you know. Mrs. Green always believed that kindness ripples out into the world, touching others in ways you'll never see." Samantha wiped away a tear and nodded. She had felt the truth of those words in her own life, how a simple act of kindness could change everything. It had changed her, and now she was living proof of the power of compassion. As the years went by, Samantha continued her work as a flight attendant, but she also began to take on more leadership roles within the airline. She was promoted to a supervisory position, where she could influence the training and attitudes of other staff members. She worked tirelessly to instill the values of empathy and kindness into the team, encouraging them to always approach their passengers with respect and understanding. She often shared her story with new recruits, telling them about Mrs. Green and how one simple encounter had set her on a path of transformation. She made sure they knew that no matter their background, no matter their age, every passenger deserved kindness. Every person was carrying something that made them who they were, and that deserved to be respected. One day, after a particularly long flight, Samantha found herself seated next to a young woman who seemed frustrated and defeated. She had been traveling for hours, and the exhaustion was evident on her face. Samantha had been in the same position countless times, tired, frustrated, and feeling invisible. But instead of turning a blind eye as she might have before, Samantha struck up a conversation with the woman. They talked for the entire flight. The woman revealed that she had recently lost her job and was facing a difficult transition in her life. Samantha listened patiently, offering words of comfort and encouragement. She didn't offer solutions, she simply listened. By the time the plane landed, the woman's expression had softened, and she thanked Samantha for taking the time to talk. As they parted ways at the airport, the woman turned to Samantha and said, "You don't know what this conversation meant to me. I've been feeling so alone, but you reminded me that I'm not invisible." Samantha smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't the first time she had made a difference in someone's life, and it wouldn't be the last. She had learned from Mrs. Green that small acts of kindness could ripple out and touch the lives of others in ways that were beyond our understanding. One rainy afternoon years later, Samantha received a letter in the mail. It was an invitation to a memorial service for Mrs. Green, who had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Samantha's heart ached at the thought of losing the woman who had changed her life so profoundly. The letter was filled with kind words from Mrs. Green's family, who spoke of her life and legacy. Samantha attended the service with a deep sense of gratitude. She knew that Mrs. Green's kindness had been a beacon in her life, but she hadn't realized just how far-reaching that influence had been. As she sat among the people who had loved Mrs. Green, Samantha understood that the elderly woman had touched countless lives, not just hers. And that legacy would live on, in the stories shared by those she had helped, and in the way her example had shaped the world. As the service came to an end, Samantha found herself standing by Mrs. Green's grave, looking out over the landscape. The rain had stopped, and a ray of sunlight pierced through the clouds, casting a warm glow on the ground. Samantha whispered a silent thank you to the woman who had given her the greatest gift of all, the power of kindness, of seeing others with empathy, and of transforming the world one act at a time. And as she walked away, she knew that Mrs. Green's legacy would live on in her and in everyone whose life she had touched. Samantha's life had become a testament to the enduring power of kindness. Each year she returned to Central Park, where she had met Mrs. Green's sister, a reminder of the lasting connection she'd forged through one simple, powerful act. These visits, filled with quiet reflection, gave Samantha time to think about her own journey, and the ripple effect that had radiated out from Mrs. Green's kindness. Samantha had recently been promoted to a senior leadership role within the airline, overseeing a department that focused on customer service training. Her approach was simple but effective. She created workshops that were less about technical skills and more about teaching her staff how to engage with passengers on a personal level. It wasn't just about delivering services. It was about making a human connection with every single person they encountered. She often shared her story about Mrs. Green in these workshops, always emphasizing that empathy could make all the difference. She'd tell her team that when passengers were difficult or upset, it wasn't a reflection of them but of what the passenger was going through. Whether it was a delayed flight or a personal tragedy, everyone carried their own burdens. By extending kindness and understanding, they had the chance to make someone's day better, just as Mrs. Green had done for her. It wasn't long before Samantha's department saw a marked improvement. Employee satisfaction was higher, as the staff felt more connected to the passengers and to each other. The airline's customer satisfaction scores soared, and the team felt a shared sense of purpose. They had all become part of a larger mission, to spread kindness wherever they went. One day, several years after Mrs. Green's passing, Samantha received an unexpected call. It was from Mrs. Green's family, who had invited her to a gathering at Mrs. Green's former home. They wanted to honor her memory, and they had heard about how much Mrs. Green's kindness had influenced Samantha's life. Her family had seen the ways in which Samantha had carried her legacy forward, and they wanted to thank her for the impact she had made. Samantha accepted the invitation and made her way to the small house on the outskirts of the city. As she arrived, she was struck by how warm and welcoming it felt, just like Mrs. Green had been. Inside, there were photos of the elderly woman at various stages of her life, smiling, laughing, always with a twinkle in her eye. Samantha felt a deep sense of gratitude for having known her. She was greeted by Mrs. Green's daughter, a woman with a warm smile and eyes that reminded Samantha so much of her mother. "Samantha, we've heard so much about you. My mom would be so proud to see all the good you've done in the world." Samantha smiled back, feeling the weight of those words. "Mrs. Green changed my life in ways I can never fully explain. She gave me a perspective that has stayed with me, and I try to honor that every day." The family gathered around her, sharing stories of Mrs. Green's life, her contributions to the community, and the countless lives she had touched. It was clear that Mrs. Green had been a force of love and compassion in their lives. They spoke of her dedication to others, her work with charities, and how she had always gone out of her way to help those in need. "I know she's gone," Mrs. Green's daughter said softly, "but it feels like she's still here, guiding us. You're proof of that, Samantha." The conversation continued late into the evening, and Samantha found herself overcome with emotion. She had always known that Mrs. Green's influence had shaped her, but hearing it from those who had known her most intimately made her realize the depth of her impact. Mrs. Green's legacy wasn't just about her kindness. It was about the way she had cultivated a spirit of giving, of seeing beyond the surface and understanding what truly mattered. As Samantha left the gathering that evening, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The words Mrs. Green had spoken to her years ago had become more than just lessons. They had become a way of life. And now she was a part of a greater story, a story that would continue through everyone she had touched. Over the next few years, Samantha's impact continued to grow, but she knew that she couldn't do it alone. She began seeking out others who shared her values, people who were committed to making the world a better place through small acts of kindness. Together, they formed a community, a network of like-minded individuals who were committed to spreading empathy, compassion, and understanding in their own unique ways. They started programs that reached beyond the airline industry. They worked with schools, teaching students about the importance of empathy and how to cultivate meaningful relationships with people from all walks of life. They partnered with local charities, offering time and resources to those who were struggling. They even launched a campaign to honor Mrs. Green's memory, dedicating a scholarship in her name for young people pursuing careers in social work, counseling, and community outreach. Through it all, Samantha never lost sight of what had started it all. She continued to think about the lessons Mrs. Green had taught her, the power of one kind word, one simple gesture of kindness. And as her network of kindness grew, so did the sense of fulfillment she felt. She knew that Mrs. Green's legacy would never fade, because kindness was an enduring force that would never go out of style. As Samantha sat in her office one afternoon reflecting on her journey, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The world had changed in so many ways since she had first met Mrs. Green on that airplane, and she had changed along with it. She had gone from being someone who barely acknowledged others to someone who sought to make their lives better. She had grown from a flight attendant into a leader, a mentor, and an advocate for kindness. Samantha knew that her work was far from over. There were still so many people to reach, so many lives to touch. But she also knew that she had already made a difference, and she would continue to do so day after day, just as Mrs. Green had done in her own quiet way. Samantha had learned that kindness wasn't something you did once. It was a practice, a commitment to living a life that honored the dignity of every person you encountered. And as she looked out the window, her thoughts drifted back to the words Mrs. Green had once shared with her. "Kindness is the thread that binds us all together." Samantha smiled to herself, knowing that she would continue to weave that thread, one act at a time, for as long as she lived. Years had passed since that pivotal moment with Mrs. Green. Samantha's work had reached new heights. She had risen through the ranks in her airline, but her influence had extended far beyond just her workplace. Through her advocacy for kindness and empathy, she had touched many lives, creating a ripple effect of change across different communities. As Samantha reflected on her journey, she often thought about how much her life had changed in such a short amount of time. When she first encountered Mrs. Green, she was just an impatient flight attendant, focused on her own stress and personal struggles. But now, she had become a catalyst for positive change. She was leading workshops not only for flight attendants, but also for employees in other industries, including healthcare, education, and hospitality. Her message was simple, but powerful. Treat people with kindness and respect, no matter their background or circumstances. She had learned that her work didn't stop at the airport. It had become a lifestyle, a guiding principle in every interaction, every conversation. Samantha had dedicated her life to spreading the values Mrs. Green had instilled in her, ensuring that kindness became a core part of every organization she worked with. One day, as Samantha was preparing for another flight, she received a call from her old mentor. It was Susan, one of the senior flight attendants who had been with her from the beginning. Susan was calling to ask if Samantha could speak at a conference she was organizing, focused on customer service and leadership. The theme of the event was Leading with Compassion. Samantha felt honored and agreed immediately, knowing that it was yet another opportunity to share the message that had shaped her own success. The event was set for the following month, and Samantha began preparing her speech, thinking about how she could connect her story to the theme of compassion. The day of the conference arrived, and Samantha stood before an audience of over 500 professionals from all walks of life. She had been invited as the keynote speaker, a recognition of the work she had done in spreading kindness and empathy within the workplace. As she stepped up to the podium, she felt a familiar surge of nerves, but she quickly reminded herself of the mission she had taken on, to inspire others to change their perspective, just as Mrs. Green had done for her all those years ago. "Good morning, everyone," Samantha began. Her voice, though slightly shaky at first, grew stronger with each word. "I'm here today because of one woman who changed my life in ways I could never have imagined. You see, I wasn't always the person standing before you, teaching you how to lead with compassion. I was once the flight attendant who didn't have time to look up from her tasks to truly see the people around her. I was the one who failed to recognize that every person who steps onto a plane or walks through our doors is carrying something. Something we might never understand, but something that deserves to be respected." Samantha paused and scanned the room, noticing the faces of the audience. She could see that her words were resonating. "I had the privilege of meeting a woman, Mrs. Green, who reminded me that kindness is not an option, it's a responsibility. She taught me that how we treat others has the power to change the course of their day, their life, and maybe even the world." She shared the story of how she had been dismissive of Mrs. Green, thinking her just another elderly passenger causing inconvenience, and how that moment had led her to understand that kindness was far more important than any task she had on her to-do list. "Sometimes, the people who we least expect to have an impact on us are the ones who change us the most," Samantha continued, her voice gaining confidence. "And when I realized how much Mrs. Green had transformed me with one simple act of kindness, I knew I had to carry that lesson forward." She spoke about the ripple effect of kindness, how it spreads like waves in a pond, touching people in ways you could never anticipate. She reminded her audience that leadership wasn't just about numbers, efficiency, or productivity. It was about understanding, patience, and compassion. We often measure success by how many tasks we accomplish, how quickly we can get things done. But what truly matters is how we make others feel, and how we use our position to uplift those around us. The room was silent as her words sank in. She could see the emotion on the faces of the audience members, who had all come to learn how to be better leaders. They had expected to hear about business strategies or management techniques, but instead they were hearing a story of transformation, of humanity and connection. Samantha ended her speech by saying, "I stand here today not because I am special, but because I was fortunate enough to learn a lesson that so many people overlook. If we can treat every person we meet with respect and compassion, the world will be a better place, one small act at a time." The audience erupted into applause, and Samantha's heart swelled with pride. She had done it. She had shared Mrs. Green's legacy in a way that would continue to ripple out far beyond her speech. In the years that followed, Samantha's work continued to grow. She had built an entire network of compassionate leaders who shared her vision of a kinder, more empathetic world. Together, they launched programs to support disadvantaged communities, providing mentorship, educational resources, and career development opportunities. They focused on helping people who had been overlooked by society, teaching them that they were worthy of kindness too. Samantha's story was shared in magazines, podcasts, and articles, inspiring people all over the world. She was recognized as one of the leading voices in customer service and leadership training. But more than that, she had become a symbol of the power of kindness in leadership. She had even opened a non-profit in Mrs. Green's honor, dedicated to helping elderly people who had been marginalized by society. The organization provided support for seniors who had limited access to health care, transportation, or community resources. They offered emotional support, social activities, and a platform for older adults to share their wisdom with younger generations. Samantha spent much of her free time working with the non-profit, continuing the mission that Mrs. Green had so gracefully passed on to her. She had built a legacy of her own, but it was built on the foundation of one simple, powerful truth that Mrs. Green had taught her, that every person, no matter their age, background, or appearance, deserved respect and kindness. One afternoon, years after Mrs. Green had passed, Samantha found herself standing in the very same park bench where she had met Mrs. Green's sister all those years ago. It was a bright, beautiful day, and the park was alive with people, just as it had been when Samantha first sat down to talk to Mrs. Green's sister. As she sat there reflecting on everything she had accomplished, she thought about the incredible journey that had started with one small act of kindness. Her heart was full, knowing that her life had been changed forever by Mrs. Green, and now she was continuing to spread that light to others. She smiled softly to herself. The legacy of kindness was a never-ending cycle. Mrs. Green's influence had touched her, and she, in turn, had touched so many others. And the world, one small act at a time, was a little bit brighter because of it. And as Samantha sat there, surrounded by the beauty of the park, she felt Mrs. Green's presence in the quiet breeze. It was as if the world was telling her that the work was far from over, but the journey had been worth every moment. With a final deep breath, she stood up, ready to continue sharing Mrs. Green's message of compassion with the world. Samantha's work in leadership and kindness continued to grow, but she knew that even in a world where empathy was flourishing, there was still much more to be done. She had learned over the years that the true test of leadership wasn't how well you could manage projects or hit targets. It was how you could uplift others, especially in times of hardship and adversity. One day, she received an unexpected call from a fellow leader in the non-profit sector. It was Sarah, the CEO of a large organization dedicated to providing services for at-risk youth in underserved communities. Sarah explained that her organization had been struggling to find effective ways to engage with young people who had been affected by systemic poverty, violence, and neglect. "We've been doing everything we can, Samantha," Sarah said, "but it feels like we're just putting band-aids on bigger wounds. The kids don't trust us, and they don't believe in our programs. I know we need to do something different, but I don't know where to start." Samantha had always believed that building trust was the first step toward meaningful change. She agreed to visit Sarah's organization and see firsthand what was happening on the ground. When she arrived, she was struck by the energy in the room. The staff were passionate, and the youth seemed eager to engage. But there was a wall between them, a deep mistrust that no amount of program marketing or community outreach seemed to be able to break down. Samantha spent several days with the team, observing how they interacted with the young people. She noticed that despite their best efforts, the staff had become increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress. They were trying hard, but their approach was too clinical, too impersonal. That's when it hit her. She remembered her early days as a flight attendant, how distant she had been from the passengers, how she had failed to connect with people because she hadn't seen them as individuals. In those moments of realization, she understood that what was needed here wasn't just another program or a set of strategies. It was a shift in how they saw the youth they were trying to help. Samantha's idea was simple but radical. Instead of focusing solely on the services and programs, they needed to focus on building real human connections. She gathered the team together and shared her vision with them. "We're so focused on giving these kids what we think they need," Samantha said. "But what if what they need most isn't another service? What if they need us to listen, to see them as individuals, and to build a relationship of trust with them? What if we just gave them our time, our attention, and our respect? No strings attached. At first, the staff were skeptical. They had been trained to run programs, to implement strategies, and to track measurable outcomes. But Samantha's passion was infectious, and soon they all agreed to give her approach a try. The following week, Samantha and the team began making small changes. Instead of launching a new program right away, they decided to focus on one-on-one conversations with the youth. No lectures, no expectations, just real, honest discussions about who they were and what they needed. It wasn't easy at first. The youth were guarded, unsure whether they could trust anyone. But Samantha encouraged the staff to be patient and consistent, to show up every day and just be present. Slowly but surely the walls began to come down. The kids began to open up, to share their stories, their hopes, and their fears. Over time, the shift in the organization was nothing short of miraculous. By focusing on relationships rather than programs, the staff began to earn the youth's trust. The young people, in turn, started to believe that someone truly cared about their well-being, that they were worth more than the circumstances they had been born into. One young woman named Maria had been one of the most difficult to engage with. She was 17 and had spent most of her life in foster care, moving from one family to the next, never really feeling at home. Maria had been resistant to the new approach, skeptical that anyone would actually listen to her. But one day, after weeks of patiently talking with Samantha's team, Maria opened up. She told them about the pain she'd carried from being abandoned, the loneliness that had defined her life. For the first time in a long time, Maria felt heard. As she shared her story, she began to realize that there was hope for her. She had been so focused on surviving, she hadn't considered that she could thrive. With the support of the team, Maria began to change. She enrolled in a program that helped her get her high school diploma, and she started working part-time at a local cafe. Maria's transformation was a testament to the power of connection and empathy. She wasn't the only one. The entire group of youth began to show improvements, not just in academic performance or behavior, but in how they viewed themselves. They started to take pride in who they were, their unique backgrounds, and their ability to overcome adversity. Sarah, the CEO of the organization, was amazed by the changes she was seeing. "I didn't realize how much we were missing by not just listening," she said one afternoon. "You were right, Samantha. It's not just about providing services. It's about giving these kids the respect they've never had and showing them they matter." Samantha smiled, knowing that this was the start of something bigger than just one organization. It was a movement. As word spread about the success of their approach, other organizations began to reach out, asking for advice on how to implement similar strategies. Samantha's role in this new chapter was pivotal. She had taken what she learned from Mrs. Green, the value of seeing people, really seeing them, with kindness and respect, and applied it to the most difficult and underserved populations. Her work had evolved from simply advocating for kindness in customer service to transforming entire communities. At the same time, she continued her work with the airline, training new leaders in the art of empathy and compassion. Her life had become a delicate balancing act of leadership, mentorship, and service. Yet, through it all, she remained committed to the principle that had shaped her journey. One act of kindness could change everything. As her non-profit work expanded, she began to notice a pattern. She could trace the success of each initiative back to that single truth. Kindness changes lives. It didn't matter whether you were working with troubled youth or busy travelers. Kindness had the power to transform. Samantha had become a sought-after speaker, traveling the world to share her message. But despite the recognition and accolades, she always returned to one thing: Mrs. Green, the elderly woman who had shown her that the most important job in the world was to treat others with dignity and respect. One evening, as Samantha sat on a park bench near Central Park, just as she had done all those years ago when she first encountered Mrs. Green's family, she reflected on everything that had transpired since that day. She realized that the kindness she had received had come full circle. Mrs. Green's impact had changed not just her life, but the lives of thousands, maybe even millions of people. She smiled, knowing that Mrs. Green's legacy would continue to ripple through the world. And as long as Samantha was breathing, she would carry that message forward, because kindness was, and always would be, the most powerful tool for change. As she stood up from the park bench and looked out over the city, Samantha felt a sense of peace. She had lived her life in a way that honored Mrs. Green's teachings, and the results spoke for themselves. Kindness, as Mrs. Green had shown her, was never wasted. It always came back in unexpected ways, often when you least expected it. And so Samantha walked forward with a heart full of gratitude and a spirit ready to spread more kindness. She had learned that kindness wasn't just a moment. It was a lifetime of giving, of opening hearts, and of changing the world one person at a time. As she walked into the future, she knew that Mrs. Green's legacy was safe in her hands, and it would live on forever. Years had passed, and Samantha had become an internationally recognized figure in leadership and kindness. She had spoken at conferences, worked with global nonprofits, and transformed countless lives, both through her work and her personal actions. But as much as she had achieved, she never lost sight of where it all began. One crisp autumn afternoon, after an emotionally fulfilling day spent mentoring youth in a new city, Samantha decided to take a walk through a nearby park. She found herself drawn to the bench where, many years ago, she had sat with Mrs. Green's sister. It was here that she had first learned the importance of truly seeing people, of connecting with them in ways that made them feel valued. Samantha's footsteps slowed as she approached the bench, her heart full of gratitude. This was the place where it all started, the place where her journey of transformation began. As she sat down, she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool breeze wash over her. Everything in her life had led her to this point, but she couldn't help but think back to the day she had mocked Mrs. Green and the humbling lesson that followed. She could still hear Mrs. Green's soft voice in her mind, her words about kindness and respect echoing through the years. Samantha took a deep breath, thinking of all the lives she had touched, and all the people who had in turn touched hers. She had built a legacy of compassion that now spanned the globe. Yet it all began with a single act of kindness. One moment of clarity, one encounter that changed her forever. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her back to the present. It was a message from Sarah, the CEO of the youth organization they had worked with years ago. Sarah was letting her know that one of the young people they had mentored had just been accepted into a prestigious university on a full scholarship. Samantha smiled, her heart swelling with pride. This was the ripple effect of kindness at work. One life transformed, and in turn, that transformation spread like wildfire, changing the lives of others in ways no one could have predicted. As she looked around the park, she saw the faces of families, of children laughing, of people walking their dogs. In the distance, she noticed an elderly couple sitting on a bench, sharing a quiet conversation. Samantha smiled to herself, knowing that each of these people, no matter who they were, had their own stories, their own struggles, and their own moments of transformation. Just as Mrs. Green had shown her years ago, everyone has a story, and everyone deserves to be seen, to be heard, and to be treated with kindness. Samantha stood up from the bench, taking one last look at the park before walking away, her mind filled with gratitude. She had spent so much time building her own legacy, but now she knew it was time to pass the torch. As she walked toward the future, Samantha didn't just see a world full of problems. She saw a world full of opportunities to connect, to listen, and to change lives, one small act of kindness at a time. And so, the cycle of kindness continued. The legacy of one simple act of compassion had blossomed into a movement that had touched thousands, maybe millions of lives. Samantha was no longer just the woman she had been before, impatient, quick to judge. She had become a beacon of hope and a symbol of the power of kindness. Just as Mrs. Green had taught her all those years ago, Samantha knew that no act of kindness was ever too small to matter. It wasn't just about the grand gestures, the public speeches, or the accolades. It was about the quiet, everyday moments when you chose to see someone for who they truly were, and to offer them the respect they deserved. And so, with that thought in her heart, Samantha continued her walk, knowing that the legacy of kindness would live on forever, not just in her work, but in every person she had ever touched, and in every life that had been transformed by the simple act of kindness. As she disappeared into the crowd, the city buzzing with life, it was clear that Mrs. Green's influence had never truly left her. It was a part of her, a guiding light that would continue to lead her and the world for many years to come.